Right.
Hello, welcome to Ethex's webinar. I'm Lisa Ashford and I'm CEO of two positive investment platforms, Ethex and Energize Africa. Today's theme is sustainable transport and I'm joined by a wonderful set of panelists today. First of all, Sarah Lunnan from Extinction Rebellion, Daniel Heary from Charge My Street, Mark Hodgson from Co-Cars, and Ali Claburn from LiftShare. Thanks everyone for joining me today. It's great to have you all here virtually. I'll give you a second to introduce yourselves shortly. So the format of the session today is that I'm going to open up, set the context for the webinar. I'll be asking the panel a series of questions, and at the end of that time we can also open up to questions as well from the audience. And we have a you can submit your questions through the chat function as we go along, and if I can pull them into the discussion as we go, then I will. Otherwise we'll try and answer them at the end. We've got 45 minutes to an hour schedule for the session, depending on how many questions we have and how rowdy the panel are. And yes, obviously I just need to say that this conversation shouldn't be treated as any kind of financial advice. We can't answer any questions regarding your own specific financial personal circumstances, and this is not a financial promotion in any way, but we do have lots of information on some of these lovely organisations on our website, which you can read up about after the session. And we will try and send out a email after the event and with some more information and links if there's anything that can be useful to you to extend your learning in this area of sustainable transport. So if we could just say a quick hello and two-sentence update, and if we could do it in the order of Mark, Sarah, Daniel, and then Ali, and then I'll kick off.
Okay, so hi, I'm Mark Hodgson. I'm MD of Co-Cars. We offer on-demand share mobility in the Southwest. That means we provide cars, electric bikes, and also electric co-delivery for our platform, and we're obviously on Ethex, and we're doing a share raise at the moment to grow our network.
Hi, I'm Sarah Lunnan. I'm actually part of the political circle of Extinction Rebellion. We're a non-violent direct action group set up to highlight the tragedy that's coming down the line to us from climate change and the loss of our natural world. And obviously part of how we move around has a huge impact on all of that.
Hi, my name is Daniel Heary. I'm the Chief Exec of Charge My Street, and we focus on EV charging points for people who live in homes that don't have their own driveway. So most people charge up on their own private driveway. If you live in a terrace or a flat, you don't have that drive, then it's really difficult to get an EV and make that switch.
Oh, you're on mute.
I promised myself I'd never do that. My name is Ali Claburn. I'm the founder chief exec of LiftShare, a social enterprise that's been going for 20 years, focusing on helping people to commute more sustainably. Earlier this year, we hit our 1 billion miles saved, and we pre-COVID were having around 1 million shared trips every month.
Thank you very much, everyone. So setting the context, thinking about where we are at this point in time. So for me, certainly, COVID has brought a kind of peace to the streets for the last month or so. And, you know, there's dramatically fewer cars on the roads, and there's less noise and air pollution. And, you know, I think a lot of us have certainly welcomed that. And as I walk through my village, you know, it is certainly a pleasure to have less cars on the roads. And also I'm able to take my kids out cycling on the roads as well, which is also, you know, I wouldn't have done that before. And I think that gives us some kind of sense of what things could be like. And obviously, not only does it have local benefits in terms of, nice cup of tea there, in terms of the air and noise pollution, but obviously the carbon emissions have been quite dramatically reduced as well. As we pointed out in our other webinar though, there's a long way to go in terms of where we need to get to on our targets, so we can't rest on our laurels there. And as we start to open up activity and get the economy moving, we've got a real opportunity to accelerate green investments and also think about building a more sustainable economy. Having said that, there's sort of a bit of conflicting messaging coming out. And as we ease lockdown, the government's sort of discouraging people from taking public transport and encouraging people to get into their cars. But by the same token, many cities are proposing that huge areas of their sort of central inner city are dedicated to cycling and pedestrians and having less cars. And cities such as Milan and Paris and London have set out plans to provide that kind of state of play in future years. And I think that wouldn't have happened without getting to this COVID state, this pause. And, you know, the UK's made several announcements over the last month or so on its decarbonisation of transport report and a number of funding windows for electric vehicles and such like. So, you know, not everyone can afford an electric car though. So what do we do? And the charging infrastructure is not fully in place across the UK. So how can we build a better sustainable transport system for all in a fair and equitable way, emphasising those key last words as well. So I'm going to open up the debate to the panel, and I'm going to ask firstly then, so what is needed to build the infrastructure for a more sustainable low carbon transport system in the UK? And I'm actually going to, and perhaps we can talk about some of the examples of who's got it right or has anyone got it right so far. But first, I think we should get that big picture just to make sure that we have razor sharp vision. So Sarah, if you could just lead the charge there and give us your view, and then I'll throw it out to the others afterwards.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure I'm the best person to start talking about what's needed in terms of the infrastructure of this, but I think you've outlined some of those bigger questions that we need to start asking ourselves. So when it came to COVID, we were asked to stay at home and only to go out if it was an essential journey. I think pretty much in terms of addressing the climate, we need to start looking at our transport through a similar lens. So every time we think about making a journey, especially if it's a powered journey, we need to start saying, is this an essential journey? Do I actually need to do this? And I think it's that fundamental review, and it's a question of limits, of accepting maybe some limits around our transport, not requirement, but the amount of transport that we're willing to undertake, and to actually start limiting that so that we can perhaps not limit those other things like birdsong, like our children playing in the roads, like our children being able to go and visit our friends, because that's what we limit at the moment. And also, we accept those levels of accident rate, we accept the levels of fear on our roads, we accept air pollution and all the early deaths that brings about with it, as well as the environmental damage. So, I mean, I'm sitting here saying we need that systemic change to the way we move around and the way we look about our ability to travel, as opposed to, I think, some of the other panelists who are perhaps looking at the slightly more incremental change. So things pretty much stay the same, but we might take some incremental changes around how we power those vehicles or how we move around.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Ali, do you want to come in on that to talk about, so we're talking a bit about behavioural change there, as much as we are about technological advance. So in terms of the behavioural change, what are you seeing, Ali?
I actually very much agree with Sarah. I think this has given us an amazing chance to see what is possible and what people want to do. We did a survey a couple of weeks ago of lots of commuters asking how they wanted to travel post-lockdown, and there was a huge increase, 400% increase in people wanting to work from home. So I think we have seen a shift, and I think it's now up to us to try and maintain those kind of levels of low travel. The idea of thinking about every journey before you're doing it is really important, particularly if you need to go by car. So what we're seeing moving forward is a big demand and increase for walking and cycling, huge increase in people wanting to work from home, drops in the short term of public transport, buses and trains, and a slight increase in the number of people who want to share trips, but they don't want to go back. People don't want to go back to work 5 days a week. They want to go back to work like 1 or 2 days a week, or work from a local office. So if I was approaching it now, I'd be looking at the options available and the demand for those options. I wouldn't be building any infrastructure until we have a much clearer picture of the demand for travel, because what we've seen is there isn't actually that much demand when you change the rules.
Mark, do you want to come in on that? Because, you know, I think your business is experiencing changes at the moment, and you're probably getting feedback on what people want. How do you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, we were the first to bring in sort of on-street docked electric bike network in the UK, and we're in a couple of months' time we'll be the largest docked in the UK. So if you're talking from a bikes perspective, you know, we've seen a huge increase. We've given bikes to NHS and police who have been using them, so that's a whole change. Police using electric bikes, looking after the city. The NHS we've given for free. We've had huge usage, and our usage of electric bikes now is higher than it's ever been. We've had people commuting 10 miles on our electric bikes. You know, we just don't have those sort of numbers, because electric bikes are a huge change. And one of the reasons why people don't tend to go on bikes is because they don't feel safe and they don't have the infrastructure. And we've been given the opportunity to create that infrastructure and opportunity. And I think that's a real positive. And I know a lot of cities, and I know Exeter is looking at that as well. So there's a real opportunity, because it's about how people feel. You know, most people hate their commute. They don't want to do it, but if they can feel they enjoy the cycling around, and that's a really important point. So I think we're seeing a huge change there, and I think from an infrastructure perspective, we need to be locking in that change. And it's really interesting, the government recently announced the fact that it's going to allow pubs and bars to potentially take over the pavements as a permitted place, maybe more continental. Well, if they're going to do that, then people are going to have to take over the road, and that's going to have to be a better space, because obviously you're not going to be able to walk around if you're going to. So they actually, a lot of the time when businesses have said, oh, well, they're concerned about maybe closing roads down or changing because it's going to impact on my business, even though a lot of studies show that doesn't happen. But actually this is an opportunity to create that space, and maybe the businesses were more interested in that, and I would certainly see that the case. I think from the cars perspective, yes, obviously initially people weren't using them, but we're beginning to see interest in it. I think the key thing from our shared mobility perspective is shared mobility has a number of benefits that sort of play into this. I guess number one is the fact that it's equitable. So everybody can access an electric car. You don't have to buy one, and it's much cheaper than leasing. And there's going to be a recession, and people who have leased cars are going to have a lot of problems. 90% of new cars are leased, and the average car is used 3% of its time. So that's a real problem. Two, the average city in this country is about 40% dedicated to cars and roads and parking. And yet actually that's a real misallocation of space. And if you have shared space, shared cars or shared bikes, you can then create better social distancing and actually better livable cities, which is actually what we want to do, because, you know, transport is a function of the economy and how people want to live. And if we can put it from an economic frame, it's a real opener. Shared mobility is that for that space. I think there's a lot of things in change, but it's that mindset. But it's interestingly, I've not, since lockdown, I've not stopped having developers come and talk to us about new housing developments. We offer sort of shared mobility, electric cars, electric bikes, electric cargo bikes, and that hasn't changed. In fact, we've had more interest in that space because there's potentially looking at other space around them. So I think there's infrastructure, but you need to follow the change. If the change is there, come on, let's lock some of that change in, which is very much what Sarah was saying and Ali was saying, lock that change in. Mm-hmm. There's a willingness, but it's been suppressed up till now.
And what are you finding, Daniel, in terms of where you operate? You know, because we can talk about big cities, and you know, Paris has made some statements about how it's going to, you know, remove a lot of its inner city parking, and you know, they're going to change the way that they are designing the sort of centre of the city to run. But what about your region? Perhaps you can just explain where you are and what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think everyone's been very positive about the improvements to air quality during lockdown, and I think there is a real sense that they want to continue that. But as they start to go back to work, there's also this push to get people back into cars as well. So if we can actually find a way through that and switch more of those journeys to electric vehicles, then that helps to improve the situation. I think the challenge that we find operating also in more rural areas as well as the smaller towns is while there's significant amounts of investment coming out of being announced by central government, it will get channeled through local authorities. And most of those local authorities don't have the capacity to actually go out and find out where those charge points should be, to liaise properly with local communities and understand where they can be best located. And we've been working a lot with some of these authorities to say, okay, how do we build this bridge between their sort of top-down approach that they want to do, but also the sort of community-based bottom-up approach, so that we actually put these charge points where people want them. And my sense is if we actually engage people in that process, then the infrastructure will go into the right places where it's going to be used most. I think looking more broadly as well, I think the way to work in the future is around having a much more broader mix of different travel options for people. So we work a lot with rural car clubs, seeing how we can actually replace this thing of having every car, every house having 2 cars, to bringing that down to maybe 1.5 cars, with that half made up by sharing vehicles. So there's an awful lot to actually look at. And there's also the thing that really excites me is how we actually use these car batteries that are plugged in to actually put power back into the grid at peak times, this vehicle to grid, so we can actually harness more of that renewables that people are capturing while they're at home.
Yeah, which is an excellent thought. Let's sort of pin that for a minute. You mentioned about working with the local authorities, and I think it's a good question. What do we see the role of local authorities and government to be in terms of setting policy, and how do we marry that sort of top-down versus bottom-up approach? Are they doing enough? What can they do more? Sarah, let's hear from you first.
Well, I mean, local authorities tend to be have the ability, they are the highway authority at the end of the day, apart from the major roads, which come under whatever it is at the moment. Highways England, I think they're calling themselves at the moment, with the DFT. So local authorities have the ability to hugely shape our urban environments and what they look like. And I would say that they have to take a huge amount of the responsibility for the total mess that we are finding ourselves in, and the lack of options that people currently have. So Grant Shapps has come out and said, I think he said it on May the 9th, that local authorities should start reallocating road space towards pedestrians and cyclists. And apart from a few notable exceptions taking place in a couple of the major cities at a few locations, they've done absolutely nothing. The lack of initiative and farsightedness amongst the local authorities means that I have very little faith in them being able to shape what's needed here. And you look at the places where, if you look at the Netherlands, in Holland, for example, I think the reason why we see such an amazing transport system there is some of the happiest drivers in Europe. The people driving vehicles on the road are extremely happy in the Netherlands. I think it comes down to the campaign they had in the 1970s, the Stop Killing Our Children. And they basically took to the streets, the Dutch. They took to the streets and they said, we are not going to let our children carry on being killed by the vehicles on the roads. So I guess I'm going to put it back on us, actually. I'm going to say, until we actually start acting up and start saying we are not going to accept this anymore, we demand radical change right now, we are just going to carry on with more of the same. So, I'm relatively bleak about it. And the way that our whole economy is tied into car manufacturing as well, the selling of more and more cars is always reported in the news as a good thing. That makes me equally bleak about where we're heading. So there's a few bright spots. We will sell a few more electric bikes, but until we actually demand radical change and get out and refuse to behave anymore, I don't think we're going to see very much change. I'm sorry.
Right, that's good. That's a view. We like those. Mark, have you got any more glimmers of hope for us?
I think a couple of things really, because I've worked with quite a lot of different local authorities. I do feel for them, especially when they're two-tiered authority. So a combined authority, which like you've got there, where they've got control of both highways and all access. So, for example, Birmingham or London, etc., which is in charge of its transport. It's relatively easy for them to be able to make some decisions. But a lot of local authorities are two-tier. So as a consequence, you've got to get both authorities working together. I think a lot of authorities got a lot of really good ideas. Some have got some ideas, but obviously you have to be transparent and through councils as well to work that through, and that has to go through public general pressure as well. So I think there is a balance between the public. I'm not quite as bleak as Sarah. I think there is a lot in local authorities who want to do some things, but they have to be publicly accountable. I also think we should stand back and go, a lot of the money comes from DfT and this government, the 27 more billion for roads. There's some strategic things about more roads, and then cities end up having to deal with some of that generated traffic. So I think authorities, yes, can do more. I think, yes, they can be a bit braver. And I think there's more opportunity. And I think what I would hope is that COVID creates that space to try things that often they had those ideas. And I certainly know for some authorities I've been talking to, they had some of those ideas, but they thought it was going to take them a year or two to get to. This is creating some of those opportunities to close some roads or one ways, or put some more cycling in. I certainly know there's going to be more cycling infrastructure where I am as well, which is great. So I think there is an opportunity, but I think there is also some fundamental financial elements of incentives nationally across government which cause problems. So I would urge local authorities to be brave, go and talk to the people. And as I said, with the business, I think there's an opportunity now for businesses to see this change. And as Ali said, we've seen a change. People want to work from home, or there's going to be a change in the retail experience. We already know central city centres of retail are suffering as well already. But this is an opportunity to revitalise that as well. So there are things to do, but I think there is opportunity.
Okay, and Ali, what do you think in terms of how could you work better with local authorities, and what's your experience to date?
Well, I think local authorities right now have faced a real challenge, and I feel sorry for many of them. The situation we're in is often not their fault, and the way funding's been allocated hasn't been right, and it's been coming down from central government. So I really feel for them. However, even though there's huge pressure on resources right now, they need to take this opportunity, and some of them are doing a really good job and moving quickly. The challenge is typically when money comes through, people dust off old projects and just kind of throw them into the pot again without really thinking of how they can do stuff differently. And given the amazing amount of data that's out there now, the local authorities that are moving the fastest are basing their decisions on data, not on old projects and old plans. So they're looking at where people are traveling, how they're traveling, why they're traveling, and then working out how to get them to travel better. rather than just thinking we need more roads. I mean, the idea that you need more roads in order to move more people around when 90% of the cars have only got one person in them is absolutely crazy. So the local authorities right now should be, in my mind, working much closer with the local community, the local employers, to see where their people live and work and how they can help them travel. And then using that data, then think how to think in a completely new way around travel. I mean, most people in city centres can walk and cycle, but only 40% of people live close enough to walk and cycle. The rest of us have to travel in a different way. And how can we do that most sustainably? How can we get to the edge of cities, either in shared cars, buses, trains, however, and then go in by walking, cycling, scooters, however else. But right now there's a chance to look at it. And if I was a local authority, I'd spend the next 6 months just looking at the data, seeing where people live, where they need to work, where they need to get to, and then planning a whole system based on that, and not doing any of the things we've done in the past, because quite frankly, transport for the last 30 years has gone nowhere in reducing emissions, and we've got a whole lot to do in the next 10 years.
Okay, so Sarah, I'm going to come back to you. Give us the top 3 list then. What can government do to help achieve this kind of transition to a more sustainable transport system?
What can government do? Okay, I mean, I kind of speaking as myself rather than this is not policy of Extinction Rebellion. What could government do? Make public transport free, enable local authorities to set up their own bus companies again, ban private cars from the majority of our city centres, bring it in, stop pavement parking, stop on-street parking. If you don't have a parking space, there's no reason why you should just be allowed to use the roads, for example, to store your private goods. Ban on-street, long-term on-street parking. Make public transport free, and invest all of the money we were going to put in new road infrastructure for vehicles into cycle infrastructure.
That was more than 3.
Sorry.
All right, Daniel, can I come to you? What would be the things that would really unlock what you're trying to do in terms of government policy?
I think the investments there, the problem at the moment is that the government want to put all that money through local authorities, and they work quite slowly on this. They have there's lots of issues they have to take into account around procurement and where the charge points are going to go. Some councillors do like it, others hate the thought of it because it creates more problems for them. So I think to streamline that way of getting the infrastructure funded, possibly through vouchers to local people that want to put it into a communal charge point. I think in general, central government has got the message around the infrastructure, but what is needed far more is, I suppose, broader education activities as well around people's mobility. So looking at EVs, but then also electric bikes, cycles, walking, trying to get encourage people to change their behaviour rather than just paying for infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. And can I ask Ali, Mark and Daniel, maybe Daniel, you start, just give us a sort of view of how, just briefly, how the organisation that you represent is trying to move things forward at pace, and what do you need to scale that?
Okay, yeah, so we've set up a set of tools that local people can use to actually enable them to switch to an EV away from a petrol or diesel car. So on our website, chargemystreet.co.uk, people can go on, identify local sites for charge points in their community. We're also working with car clubs, looking at the vehicle to grid stuff I mentioned earlier. But in order to scale it, it's all around local action. I mean, I started Charge My Street, I think, when I realised that the national government and international government weren't going to get near to any of the climate change goals. So it's about tapping into that local knowledge and giving people the ability to come up with local solutions to how they can decarbonise their own transport. And typically, we can work with communities if they want to do a survey in their area about people who want to switch away from petrol and diesel cars, right the way through to suggesting sites, and then work out how we can tie those people in with the wider things that are happening with their councils and with national government policy.
Ali, do you want to go next?
Yes, just jumping back to the last question, one thing that we all need is amazing broadband. What this has shown us is working from home is definitely possible for many people. Some people are still struggling a lot. So if there's one investment I would be doing is making sure that all my local community had decent broadband. In terms of moving at pace, we over the last couple of months have actually been busier than ever, but focusing in now on helping employers see how they can get their staff back to work. And so for that, we've been going through a whole framework of scoping all the journeys that people do, seeing where they live, where they work, and all the sustainable travel options they've got available to them. We will then talk them through the options. We'll bring in partners, whether it's scooter companies, bike companies, car clubs, train companies, bus companies, anyone who comes up in the results, so they can see how better to serve that organisation or all those cluster of organisations. So right now we're working with quite a few cities across the country looking at, say, their 20 biggest employers who create a huge amount of congestion on local roads, and saying, if we were to reset this, how can all these people be travelling? How many people could be working from home 2 or 3 days a week or full time? And for the rest of them, how can they get into work sustainably? And the uptake of it has been phenomenal.
Mark?
I guess from our perspective, we'd want to see, I think more bikes, looking at that, how they can do it, because electric bikes are a game changer. People have been seeing a huge increase in electric bikes because obviously suddenly your commute distance goes from maybe a couple of miles to 5 to longer, and because it's so easy. So I think you've got to rethink, how does electric bikes change the nature of the patterns, both in a city and commuting into a city? We're working with a number of different developers, both creating sort of these e-mobility hubs where you have a number of bikes, cars, buses, trains connected together, which also creates amenity. So you have these hubs where people know they can take the right appropriate transport, which is really, really important as well, both either new developments or in city developments. And I think then from the cars perspective, it's really interesting. We've had a lot of interest in terms of turning our cars into shared mobility cars in villages, and then they're there, and then they can be used as a commute into the city, be stopped and maybe take a bike or whatever. So it's thinking about how you change your blend of your services. A bit like Ali takes a bit of a higher view. I guess we're working a bit more on the lower ground level, thinking, how does that fit? The other side is from our cargo bikes. We're showing interest in the cargo bikes, of course, both for deliveries and also for people wanting to use them, because I think there's some high level forecasts looking at how much that is going to change in the next few years. But I think there's two things. I'd like to reflect back on what was said previously. I think, yes, you do need data, but I think there is a community willingness to change things now. And I would challenge the local authority to say, go and try some things, be brave, try some things. I know there's things that are going to be challenged in certain places. Try, see what the impact is, because you need, and you have the tools. There's a real opportunity from that perspective.
Thank you, Mark. Well, okay, so I'm going to try and bring in some of the questions from the audience in now. And we have about 1 million, so that is going to be quite tricky. But let's just quickly try and pick off some of them. So there's a question here about freight and cargo, and how are we going to manage that in the future? I actually did see something the other day about there was a new set of funding that's going to be available for e-cargo, which looks quite exciting in terms of development. Anyone got any thoughts on that, how we deal with that in our inner cities?
One of the things that really encouraged me was one of the initial directors of Charge My Street got a job as a courier driver for DPD, and he persuaded his manager to switch him to an EV, which meant that for all those journeys he was making, they were no longer using a standard van. But I think it's that, demonstrating to some of these larger players that you can switch to an EV. The range is good enough. it can do all the same work that you've done previously, and for a lot less money, helps to sort of get that message home.
Go on.
There was an amazing case study, and it was a few months ago, so forgive me, I can't remember the exact details, but I think it was Southampton Hospital, or a hospital in Southampton, who looked at all the deliveries being made to the hospital during the day, and then they worked out that all those trips, and there was something, I can't remember, there were hundreds or thousands of them. They worked out they could all be done in one vehicle. One lorry a day could replace literally hundreds of them. So I think the way it's done currently with everyone like on demand of everything is crazy and so inefficient and so bad for the environment and so bad for congestion. I think if we can start looking at some best-in-class case studies of how it could be done better, and then shouting about them so that employers could start taking a lead on reducing the number of trips coming to their sites, then maybe individuals at home will be doing the same thing.
Guess from, so we run co-delivery, so that's an electric cargo bike delivery. We were doing a lot of B2B initially in the city, but now we've pivoted that into B2C. So we're now doing that especially for local companies who are obviously either having to be closed or having to be very socially restricted in terms of ability of customers coming in. So we now provide B2C delivery, and of course that's all zero carbon, which is great, and we're going to be getting some more to see that growth. I think you will see the growth of sort of consolidation centres where different locations, unfortunately, because of the different types of equipment coming in, often there are different national delivery streams, and some of those are sort of inherent in their frameworks. But you will begin to see maybe consolidation centres, and then you will see electric cargo bikes and electric vans. We're introducing some electric vans this year, and those electric vans can be used by the public to share, but then they're also going to be able to be used by ourselves to do deliveries for the company as well. So it's about thinking those assets and thinking how you can maximise the use of those assets all the way through their lifetime. And I guess that's what shared mobility is all about, not just thinking about these public, it's for the business as well. So you've got that asset use, and obviously therefore the space in the city is a much more efficient use. And I think you'll see a change in that. And I know that some of the larger DPD have some electric vans and electric cargo bikes as well now as well. But I think we've got to not forget it's equitable for all, and that includes all businesses. Because often some large businesses can afford these, but then it's the small business that often are thriving city centres and thriving communities that we rely on. How do we encourage those and provide a service that helps them as well?
Thank you. Mark, I'm going to stay with you. You mentioned that you were working with housing developers earlier. Mm-hmm. And there's some questions around, changing the way in which we live and work, having more sort of perhaps affordable housing with home work units as well, which would change people's need to commute. And what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I work from some scales of thousands of homes, so with some large companies like Persimmons to small home developers. So I'm working on a number at the moment. We're providing e-mobility provision. So we're providing charging points, electric cars, electric bikes, one of them potentially electric cargo bike hire as well, with a very low provision of parking, maybe down to 0.4, even 0.2 of a space, which is much different to the standard. And some of those have been a pull. Often it's when people have got similar purposes. So we're a value-driven company, so they're looking at those. And one particular one I'm thinking of has got 50% affordable housing, which is fantastic. And they've been really keen to provide not just affordable housing, but affordable mobility. And that's really linked together. And so we will help them both either on design or in a master plan, think about how you design that for the future. How are people going to move around? And I think even some of the larger companies are now understanding that actually there's going to be a change. And that was happening anyway, but I think there's more about that livable space for people and how do you electrify that space. So I think you're seeing that change, but the trouble is policy talks about 2 car parking spaces per household. there's a lot of old legacy policy and thinking still in there. But I think some of the, and certainly if you're thinking about some of those inner city ones, they're saying, okay, how can we create great space, livable space for people, but less cars, but still the amenity of cars, because our types of audience who are going to buy our houses or flats are actually going to have a much less need. So there's some really interesting things going on, and we're working with, and also nationally that's going on as well. So that is changing. And I think the more good examples you get out there, the more other people say, oh, that's an interesting space, because there's a real economic value, obviously, for a developer if they can effectively create either better space or better higher value, or sell more homes, obviously. Okay,
thank you. Right, focusing in back to local authorities. I'm going to direct this one to Sarah first. Statements like radical change obviously have their place, but what might be the 3 most practical places to start for local authorities?
Well, stop investing in vehicles on the roads and actually put some serious money into improving the walking and cycle infrastructure. So I live in Gloucestershire, for example. Gloucestershire County Council has lobbied for an improvement to a road called the 417, the A417, that they want dual the whole way across the Cotswolds. They put £1 million of local authority money into doing starting works for that particular development to take place, be funded by Highways England. They put a lot of political will and effort into actually getting that road built, and adding a junction onto the M5 as well to expand the economy. So at the moment within Gloucestershire, all of that effort is being put into expanding the road network for vehicles, and very little, if any, is actually being put into, the political arguments you need to be having to shifting away from vehicles on the roads and shifting towards people on bicycles and on foot. And, it needs, as a starting place, they need to start doing that. And although there are certain beacons in certain places, in terms of that paradigm shift, it hasn't really happened yet. The fact that the national speed limit is still 60 miles an hour. So if you live in a rural area and your next village may be 2 or 3 miles away, which is so doable on foot or on bicycle, you can't do it because you're going to have to deal with traffic traveling at 60 miles an hour. So yeah, it's a changing mindset that's required, and it's not going to happen unless we make it happen. And it needs us to get out there and do it.
So Daniel, what practical, if you're having a conversation with your local authority about sort of getting started to put the right steps or infrastructure in place for more sustainable transport, where do you start? What's the conversation? How does it go?
So we always start with looking at where we've got local people who are interested in switching to an EV. So it starts very much with the local community, and then from that everything starts to fall out of it, because we look at where we can put a charge point within 5 minutes walk of someone's home, and then that involves speaking with local sites. Local authorities own a lot of land, so potentially they've got car parks that they can put into this, and then it's a case of what the electricity infrastructure is like there. So is there an affordable grid connection, things like that. And then we also need to look at what are people thinking of doing in the medium term. Have people got EVs already, or are they thinking of getting EVs? And from our point of view as well, we're interested in engaging people in owning that infrastructure. So it's not just working with a multinational that will come and do this. How can they actually put a little bit of investment into that, which again shows us that there's a real desire and demand for people to actually make that switch locally.
Okay, and we talked about a point earlier about putting power back into the grid. So, flipping this on its head a bit, the use of EVs to generate electricity in some kind of renewable way. How do you see that sort of expanding, and what's the potential for that?
So the way it works is your car's plugged in, and at certain times of the day when the grid is really busy, you can actually take a bit of that power back from the car and put it back into the grid, which means that we have less need to fall back on fossil fuel generation. So as we transition towards more renewables, we can actually use those batteries to store that power. And we see potentially, at the moment, we already work with some village halls that have got renewable, they've got solar panels on the roof. On a sunny day when I go and charge there, that's capturing that power locally. And it means that I'm not having to charge up at times when the grid doesn't have that surfeit of renewables. But in the medium term, as we see more renewables coming on stream, we need to find ways of actually storing that. So we have a much smaller reliance on fossil fuels.
And someone's saying this concentration on electric vehicles is quite exclusive. Well, yes, but we're talking also about sharing and different modes of transport as well. So Ali, so 2 points to you. So tell us why lift sharing is different and how it opens up the ability for different forms of transport. And what about why lift share and not have electric buses that can take a higher density of people to where they need to go?
Okay, so just looking at, say, stats for England, every rush hour there are 36 million empty seats on the road. There are 11 drivers for every 1 passenger in those cars. There is huge latent capacity in commuter cars every morning, and for all trips. If you get 2 people, every 1% increase in car occupancy takes 1 billion car miles off the road. So in terms of its potential to help at the times when most other forms of transport are completely full, sharing a lift is available on every road throughout the day, and there are people offering seats and seeking seats all over the country. It's not exclusive to rural or urban or anywhere. Right now, only a few, I think probably less than 2% of the cars on the road are electric, whereas you can make your car twice as efficient if you take a passenger. So in terms of decarbonising or making your journey cheaper, more affordable, more social, more fun, lift sharing ticks all of those boxes. And it is not zero carbon, but it enables you to halve your carbon. And given the fact we've got to decarbonise really by 2030, it takes us a long way down that route, and it changes behaviours away from people owning their own car. So as a quick win that's available right now, I mean, there are some companies who launched a lift sharing scheme last year who now have 50% of their staff sharing cars every day within a year. 50%. Imagine if every company did that. Imagine if every local authority encouraged it. Imagine if there were roads for car shares, walkers and cyclists. I mean, there is so much to green down. It's like an untapped potential, and it's pretty much completely free for people to share cars.
But what about buses? What about electric buses?
So I'm actually a huge fan of electric minibuses. I grew up, well, my early days of traveling around the world. You see all these shared minibuses taking people everywhere, no subsidy, an incredibly efficient way to travel. Why we don't have it here is typically because of weird regulation that stopped it over the years. The idea of say companies having electric van pools taking their stuff into work, cities now opening up van pool shared buses coming in, I think is a huge opportunity. The thing you've got to get right first is matching supply and demand. So again, if you go back to scoping out the data, see where people travel, then put in these services having based on the demand. Don't just put in the services and hope people will go onto them. You can target people directly. You can target people on key corridors in shared minibuses. I mean, we did some stats probably 10 years ago looking at minibuses, and we reckon that about 80% of people who couldn't walk or cycle could get to work by shared minibus, and it would cost, I think it was something like a quarter of the price of going by car. There is huge potential for them, but it's a big shift from where we are now.
Okay, and I've got to ask the elephant in the room question, because it does always come up. is what about COVID and sharing? You know, Ali, you go first, and then Mark, you go second.
Okay, so we saw a lot of guidance on this from Public Health England. If you keep it simply down to the R number, then clearly walking and cycling are the best way to travel. The government say go on your own in a car as the next best way to travel. If you give the same colleague a lift to work every day, you limit the R number to 1 or less. So the government guidelines is now, if you need to share a car, you can still share a car, but limit the number of people you're traveling with and maximize the distance in your car and keep your windows open. If all those people who are driving alone stopped driving alone and actually gave a lift to someone else, you could free up huge amounts of road space for walking and cycling, and be cutting emissions and be doing all the good stuff. However, right now, we would still tell people, don't go anywhere if you don't need to. Stay at home, work from home, and if you need to go to work, walk or cycle, and if you go by car, consider sharing it. But if you are doing that, only do it with the same person every day.
Mark?
Okay, so from the bikes perspective, obviously we're encouraging bikes because obviously that's a great form of exercise and you naturally social distance when you're on your bikes. So from a bikes perspective, we're trying to encourage people onto the bikes as much as we can, and we're bringing out more bikes as we do. And the feedback has been fantastic for that. From the cars perspective, obviously what we need to do, we're bringing a few cars back, and we have extensive, cleaning regimes, and also we're very clear with people, if you are feeling unwell, don't take the car, etc. as well. But you've also got to realise that some people do need to use the car, and also you are allowed to go to exercise as well. So and obviously we have members who might not have a car, etc. So we're trying to encourage them onto the bikes, but then the cars are heavily cleaned. And obviously then also things like open the window, as Ali said, those sort of aspects. And we always leave cleaner in the car, etc. for us. They can use themselves as well. Luckily, cars tend to be, they're soft on the steering wheel and elements of that. So it's actually, COVID doesn't actually stay there a huge amount of time as well. And we're also leaving gaps between the times you hire as well. I think there is also another element to fit to this, is obviously if more people working from home, I think there's an issue of, do people use that second car? And given the sort of recession impact, we're also hearing a slightly different pattern of usage with our cars. Normally have a lot of city centres being used, but we're beginning to see a different pattern of people wanting to use them in different locations as well. And I think that's as we begin to adapt as well. But certainly we've been asked a few times about the cleanliness, etc. But obviously as we put those sort of regimes in place, that's a lot better. I think we shouldn't forget that what we're also trying to do is we need to think about, some people inevitably will have to go on mass transit. We will have to do that. Not everybody can commute in. We don't have I totally agree with Ali, the electric buses and minibuses, I totally agree, and absolutely I'm a supporter of LiftShare. But I think we've got to think, well, if people are going to come in that, how do we add value to that? So we're looking at working with some of the other providers. So if you do come in by bus, can a bike provide that less element, etc., and how we can provide joint offers for everybody to do that trip sharing approach, because people don't have a car to access it. And there's a size proportion and quite high percentage, and I'd be interested to know, Ali knows the figures in terms of key workers that do use mass transit to come in, and they're now having to jump onto cars or are challenged in that area as well.
Go on.
Come in there. It's quite interesting in London, for example, a number of the hospitals have actually come out in support of these pop-up cycle lanes because their key workers are cycling in because they don't want to drive, they're not on the public transport anymore, and they've actually come out in calling for pop-up cycle lanes so that their staff are actually safe coming into work. And yeah, I think that's a little bright light, actually, that when the employers actually start saying, no, we want this infrastructure, I think possibly local authorities and government will start listening.
And what about, just to finish, this is a purely selfish question, actually. What about electric scooters?
Oh,
When are they going to be?
Brilliant.
When are we going to get them on the roads?
Well, they are on the roads. And, I hope people carry on using them on the roads. That's where they should be. Absolutely. Yeah, we should just keep doing it.
Mark?
I think you've got to, obviously from a shared mobility perspective, if you look at the longitudinal studies on electric scooters, they get worn out quite a lot. on shared mobility, so their lifetime is variable. I guess we've looked at this quite extensively. So from a sharing perspective, if you think of maybe very big flat spaces, but if you look at hilly towns which have got maybe not very good roads and pavements, etc., there's a damage issue as well. So I'm a bit concerned on that level. Also, from a carbon footprint perspective, there's really good research came out and said actually electric scooters are worse than electric cars from a mileage per mile perspective, because obviously they're quite high intensive to make, but they don't go that far. So I think they have their place, don't get me wrong, but I think from a shared mobility perspective, we need to think, I think you've also got to sit there from an active travel perspective. One of the things even Boris Johnson has reported in cycling this week, that he's obsessed with bikes and getting people healthy. He may well have a personal viewpoint of that as well. And I think we've got to remember that we want active travel. We want healthy people with active travel. So scooters have their blend, but I think it's really important we encourage healthy travel and active travel.
Thank you. And to try and keep up my record of finishing on time, although we could continue probably for another hour or so, I'm going to round up there. So thank you everybody for contributing. People have asked, where can I hear more about some of these great businesses and things? Well, we'll send out an email, plus go to the Ethex website. Thank you for all your different perspectives and contributions, greatly appreciated. And thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, see you for the next one. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye then.